Part 2 of Chapter 13 of Sons and Lovers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 13, Part 2. In the morning he had considerable peace, and was happy in himself. It seemed almost as if he had known the baptism of fire in passion, and it left him at rest. But it was not Clara. It was something that happened because of her, but it was not her. They were scarcely any nearer each other. It was as if they had been blind agents of a great force. When she saw him that day at the factory, her heart melted like a drop of fire. It was his body, his brows. The drop of fire grew more intense in her breast. She must hold him. But he, very quiet, very subdued this morning, went on giving his instruction. She followed him into the dark, ugly basement, and lifted her arms to him. He kissed her, and the intensity of passion began to burn him again. Somebody was at the door. He ran upstairs. She returned to her room, moving as if in a trance. After that the fire slowly went down. He felt more and more that his experience had been impersonal, and not Clara. He loved her. There was a big tenderness, as after a strong emotion they had known together. But it was not she who could keep his soul steady. He had wanted her to be something she could not be. And she was mad with desire of him. She could not see him without touching him. In the factory, as he talked to her about spiral hose, she ran her hand secretly along his side. She followed him out into the basement for a quick kiss. Her eyes, always mute and yearning, full of unrestrained passion, she kept fixed on his. He was afraid of her, lest she should too flagrantly give herself away before the other girls. She invariably waited for him at dinner-time for him to embrace her before she went. He felt as if she were helpless, almost a burden to him, and it irritated him. "But what do you always want to be kissing and embracing for?" he said. "Surely there's a time for everything." She looked up at him, and the hate came into her eyes. "Do I always want to be kissing you?" she said. "Always, even if I come to ask you about the work. I don't want anything to do with love when I'm at work. Work's work." "And what is love?" she asked. "Has it to have special hours?" "Yes, out-of-work hours." "And you'll regulate it according to Mr. Jordan's closing time?" "Yes, and according to the freedom from business of any sort." "It is only to exist in spare time?" "That's all, and not always then. Not the kissing sort of love." "And that's all you think of it?" "It's quite enough." "I'm glad you think so." And she was cold to him for some time. She hated him, and while she was cold and contemptuous, he was uneasy till she had forgiven him again. But when they started afresh they were not any nearer. He kept her because he never satisfied her. In the spring they went together to the seaside. They had rooms at a little cottage near Thettlethorpe, and lived as man and wife. Mrs. Radford sometimes went with them. It was known in Nottingham that Paul Morel and Mrs. Dawes were going together, but as nothing was very obvious, and Clara always a solitary person, and he seemed so simple and innocent, it did not make much difference. He loved the Lincolnshire coast, and she loved the sea. In the early morning they often went out together to bathe. The grey of the dawn, the far, desolate reaches of the fenland smitten with winter, the sea meadows rank with herbage, were stark enough to rejoice his soul. As they stepped on to the high road from their plank bridge, and looked round at the endless monotony of levels, the land a little darker than the sky, the sea sounding small beyond the sandhills, his heart filled strong with the sweeping relentlessness of life. She loved him then. He was solitary and strong, and his eyes had a beautiful light. They shuddered with cold, Then he raced her down the road to the green turf bridge. She could run well. Her colour soon came, her throat was bare, her eyes shone. He loved her for being so luxuriously heavy, and yet so quick. Himself was light. She went with a beautiful rush. They grew warm and walked hand in hand. A flush came into the sky, the wan moon, halfway down the west, sank into insignificance. On the shadowy land, things began to take life. Plants with great leaves became distinct. They came through a pass in the big, cold sandhills on to the beach. The long waste of foreshore lay moaning under the dawn and the sea. The ocean was a flat, dark strip with a white edge. Over the gloomy sea, the sky grew red. Quickly the fire spread among the clouds and scattered them. Crimson burned to orange, orange to dull gold, and in a golden glitter the sun came up, dribbling fierily over the waves in little splashes, as if someone had gone along and the light had spilled from her pail as she walked. The breakers ran down the shore in long, hoarse strokes. Tiny seagulls, like specks of spray, wheeled above the line of surf. Their crying seemed larger than they. Far away the coast reached out and melted into the morning. The tussocky sandhills seemed to sink to a level with the beach. Mablethorpe was tiny on their right. They had alone the space of all this level shore, the sea, and the upcoming sun, the faint noise of the waters, the sharp crying of the gulls. They had a warm hollow in the sandhills where the wind did not come. He stood looking out to sea. "It's very fine," he said. "Now don't get sentimental," she said. It irritated her to see him standing gazing at the sea, like a solitary and poetic person. He laughed. She quickly undressed. "There are some fine waves this morning," she said triumphantly. She was a better swimmer than he. He stood idly watching her. "Aren't you coming?" she said. "In a minute," he answered. She was white and velvet-skinned, with heavy shoulders. A little wind, coming from the sea, blew across her body and ruffled her hair. The morning was of a lovely limpid gold colour. Veils of shadow seemed to be drifting away on the north and the south. Clara stood shrinking slightly from the touch of the wind, twisting her hair. The sea-grass rose behind the white-stripped woman. She glanced at the sea, then looked at him. He was watching her with dark eyes which she loved and could not understand. She hugged her breasts between her arms, cringing, laughing. "Oh, it will be so cold," she said. He bent forward and kissed her, held her suddenly close, and kissed her again. She stood waiting. He looked into her eyes, then away at the pale sands. "Go, then," he said quietly. She flung her arms round his neck, drew him against her, kissed him passionately, and went saying, "But you'll come in?" "In a minute." She went plodding heavily over the sand that was soft as velvet. He, on the sandhills, watched the great pale coast envelop her. She grew smaller, lost proportion, seemed only like a large white bird toiling forward. "Not much more than a big white pebble on the beach, not much more than a clot of foam being blown and rolled over the sand," he said to himself. She seemed to move very slowly across the vast sounding shore. As he watched, he lost her. She was dazzled out of sight by the sunshine. Again he saw her, the merest white speck moving against the white, muttering sea edge. "Look how little she is," he said to himself. "She's lost like a grain of sand in the beach, just a concentrated speck blown along, a tiny white foam bubble, almost nothing among the morning. Why does she absorb me?" The morning was altogether uninterrupted. She was gone in the water. Far and wide the beach, the sandhills with their blue moraine, the shining water, glowed together in immense, unbroken solitude. "What is she, after all?" he said to himself. Here's the sea coast morning, big and permanent and